How ruthless Mexican drug cartels evolved.
Where did Mexican cartels come from in the first place? And can their origins give us any insight into how to destroy them? The roots of Mexican drug cartels have a very unlikely origin and can be
I wonder if dude got an agenda, boy. He said, and how they've evolved and how we can figure out how to destroy them.
And can their origins give us any insight into how to destroy them? The roots of Mexican drug cartels have a very unlikely origin and can be traced back to the early 1880s. At this time, Chinese migrants were hoping to come into the United States. The influx caused a reaction from the US government, which resulted in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This law prevented any Chinese migrants from entering into the US border. This led to those migrants choosing to settle in Sinaloa, Mexico instead. Here are
So wait, you could come build the railroad, but you can't come live here, huh? This is America.
at the border, these Chinese migrants
So did y'all know there's a whole Chinese community rooted in Sinaloa? I didn't know that. I know that in Puerto Rico is the same thing. There's a big Chinese community.
introduced opium to the region for the first time. Opium would then be grown in Mexico and exported into the United States ever since. This is where we start to see a tit-for-tat attempt by the US and Mexican government to stop this from happening. The 1909 Opium Exclusion Act and the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Law tried to disrupt the import of marijuana and opium, but it had the opposite effect, and all we saw was increased drug export. Then, the United States Prohibition Act of 1919 was a major attempt by the government to control people and prevent them from drinking alcohol. Mexican bootleggers in the 1920s and early 30s were a major supplier of alcohol to the illegal speakeasies and gang-sponsored distribution networks in the US. They were taking advantage of prohibition. The bootleggers would brew gallons of alcohol and smuggle it across the fairly open and unpatrolled border at the time. These groups were called tequileros. This literally translates to tequila people, but they were actually a group of smugglers during the Prohibition era that transported liquor illegally from Mexico. They used the back trails and low-water crossings through the Rio Grande into South Texas, establishing routes that would be used by cartels well into the future. It wasn't until 1927, though, that the Mexican government finally prohibited the exportation of both marijuana and opium after the United States pressured them to act. So already I'm getting the sense both sides are inadvertently making the situation worse, and their populations are also contributing to the problem. The United States came to their senses in 1933 and ended prohibition. They finally decided sharing a six-pack with the fellows shouldn't come with a felony charge. Both Mexican bootleggers and American gangsters suddenly lost their main source of income in the alcohol trade, so they shifted their focus to the lucrative illicit drug trade instead. They used already in place systems and infrastructure to smuggle illegal drugs across the border instead of alcohol. In response to this influx of narcotics, the United States passed the 1934 Uniform State Narcotic Act. It regulated legal administration of prescriptions and outright banned certain substances. This is why you need a prescription for anything stronger than Tylenol in the US, while you can get steroids over the counter in many Latin American countries. The Uniform State Narcotics Act established the legal framework that would set the stage for the next century. During the 1930s, Mexico had control over 15% of the total opium supply to the USA. The drug trade from the 1940s to the 50s continued to grow at a fast pace. It was during this time that we begin to see larger organized groups that we could classify as cartels start to rise. A major player during the time was a man by the name of Alberto Falcon, lovingly referred to as the king of the opium trade. A descendant of Chinese immigrants, Falcon started as a smuggler, helping bootleggers smuggle alcohol into the United States, but quickly cornered the opium drug market in the 1950s, a drug that was legal at the time in Mexico. Like any good businessman, Falcon expanded his business to include money laundering, weapons trafficking, and drug refinement, allowing—
It's amazing how many things came from the illegalization of something. You know, you prohibit alcohol, you open up a whole nother thing to happen, and you got to bring the alcohol back. You tweaked. Now the roots are established. The Chinos done dropped them poppy seeds off in Sinaloa. We crossing the border now. But think about it. So many things came from this. I mean, even what is it? Racing, car racing, came from bootlegging and all of this shit. The Kennedys came from bootlegging and prohibition. Like, so many things came from prohibition. You know, the strength of the mob grew during prohibition. Like, so many things that the U.S. thought that they were doing something, and they bit themselves in the ass.
Him to afford to buy officials on both sides of the border and grow his international network. It was during Falcon's time that the CIA began to take a deeper interest in the cross-border economy. In a 1950 report by the U.S. Justice Department titled Traffic in Opium and Other Dangerous Drugs, it notes a drastic rise in arrests and seizures of illegal drugs stemming from Mexico. The report noted that a large majority were originating from Falcon and his associates. This led to greater organized crime in the United States, rising addiction rates, and cross-border violence due to the drug trade. Between the 1950s and 1960s, Mexico became the main exporter of marijuana to the United States. They were responsible for 75% and 15% of marijuana and heroin supply. As the 1950s shifted towards the 60s, the United States began increasing its scrutiny in the area, involving greater CIA involvement, border control measures, and domestic crackdown of drug users. Unfortunately for the United States government, the 1960s was a high point for American drug consumption, spurred by negative reactions to the Vietnam War and a general civil unrest. This massive influx of drug demand for Mexico spurred the growth of new generation of drug lords.
Think about the 60s. This is a crazy time, you know what I'm saying? Assassinations was on the high, riots, civil rights movement, so many things was going down.
Of course, the feds weren't going to take this sitting down, and the United States began a shift from a domestic focus on handling drugs to an international one. This was spearheaded by President Nixon directly after his inauguration in 1969. This marks a turning point in this whole story. There were two driving factors that led to a thriving and powerful Mexican-based cartel organization. First, a major change in American labor laws, and second, the rise of South American, namely Colombian cartels. It was these labor laws that led to cartels first getting involved in human trafficking, and here's how. On August 4th, 1942, Mexican and American labor officials brokered a deal known as the Bracero Program, a working deal that allowed Mexican farm laborers to work for American farmers under legitimate contracts without some of the more heavy-handed working visa bureaucracy in place at the time. It was an easy way for Mexican workers to gain employment and bring back money to their families, and for American farmers to benefit from cheap imported labor. However, in 1964, the program was shut down, sparking—
I was just gonna say, how long was it before they pulled the rug out from under these people that they offered an opportunity?
However, in 1964, the program was shut down, sparking an unintended but not unexpected consequence of illegal border crossings of Mexican workers to American farms for work. But
again, an opportunity where the United States did something that they thought they should do, and it backfired on them. Because these guys already, they coming across, they coming to work, they bringing money back home. You cut that pipeline off, I got to eat. So do my kids.
But now, they lacked the protection of federal oversight. It wasn't long until the Mexican cartels that were specialized in smuggling narcotics over the border now had another major source of income: full-fledged human trafficking. Of course, being the sly businessmen that they were, they realized that the people they were shuttling over the border were a perfect vector to push a few more kilos of product into the United States, forcing desperate workers into serving as mules for the product. It was during this time that freshly elected President Nixon enacted Operation Intercept in 1969, marking the first major joint effort of the United States and Mexico to combat the influx of drugs and human trafficking. In summary, it was up to States and Mexico to combat, marking the first major joint effort of the United
Young break.
to combat the influx of drugs and human trafficking. In summary, it was a program that increased border security, brought intense search policies to anyone entering or leaving through border crossings, even bringing in the United States Navy to patrol the Gulf searching for potential narco traffic. The crackdown was so intense on border traffic that it effectively shut down the Mexican-American border. It was widely protested and debated against, and it only lasted 20 days before Nixon decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Though short-lived, it exposed the weaknesses both in the United States in controlling its own border and the resolve of the United States to stop drug trafficking at the cost of economic trade and political relations. While Operation—
But they won't do nothing about stopping the usage or rehabbing the users. That thing they want no part of.
Intercept was holding up the car line across the river, a second operation was taking place. Operation Condor, I think, fits in well here. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. I think this perfectly describes the US mentality towards the Mexican drug cartels. No one wants to be perceived as being soft on them, and for good reason. So what we see next is some pretty aggressive moves. Operation Condor was a massive undertaking by the United States and a host of South American nations and groups that involved coordination of intelligence and military operations that sought to overthrow left-leaning governments and suppress political dissidents in the region in order to prevent Soviet influence in the continent. Henry Kissinger, former United States Secretary of State, had a policy of intervention in Latin America to prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere at any cost.
Okay, this is all the CIA playing chess with all of these countries. This is the CIA. Hey, we got to stop this fire over there. We got to make sure he wins and not him over there. We got to make sure that they don't mess with them, they don't talk to them, and those don't get with them. And this guy, look at his face. He looked like the CIA, don't he? It's Henry Kissinger. He's infamous.
Kissinger, former United States Secretary of State, had a policy of intervention in Latin America to prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere at any cost. Because Condor was clandestine in nature and specific numbers of countries affected by the coup or political suppression can be hard to determine, but at least 6 countries were overthrown completely, and tens of thousands became casualties of these new, often more brutal regimes. It was this political and economic instability that allowed the rise of South American cartels. When governments are more concerned with putting down protests or arresting their own president, things like drug smuggling stop becoming a priority, and the economic turmoil caused by the widespread action led many to turn to working for these cartels to manufacture narcotics as the only way to get a paycheck. Many claim the birth of Mexico's major cartels can be traced to one man during this time, named Miguel Gallardo. He was in the perfect position to do this with insider knowledge as a...
So this is the renaissance of cartels from what I could tell. They went as far as to give us the governmental decisions that were made and the ramifications that came from them. This seems like the first time we're getting into an organized situation where there's a family or a mafia-like structure that I can see from this video. I'm sure there's all kind of other stuff that, that I'm sure you guys can hit me to that'll give me more information. But it's looking like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo,
a former federal police officer. He started working for drug traffickers in Mexico, brokering corruption of state officials. After Operation Condor, many of the drug traffickers tried to regroup and continue their operations under the consolidated Guadalajara cartel between 1978 and 1980. This powerful cartel eventually managed to control nearly all narcotics traffic operations in Mexico. Gallardo was then nicknamed the Godfather to reflect his position of power in the cartel. In the 1980s, Gallardo worked with the Colombian cocaine trafficker Pablo Escobar to distribute into the United States. The new groups were better organized, better equipped, and operated more as an actual business rather than scattered groups looking to make a quick profit. Meanwhile, in Central and South America, these cartels specialized in mass production of drugs were reaching a high point due to exponential rise in American demand for cocaine, taking advantage of the political and government instability to spread regional control. Infamous names, especially the Colombian-based cartels of Pablo Escobar, became household names. Our friends down south still had one major hurdle to overcome, and that was how to physically move their products from South American manufacturing plants into the hands of Americans, and that answer was Mexico. Using the already in place logistics and history of Mexican smuggling operations, South American cartels became established along the Mexican-American border, both rivaling and working in tandem with the Mexican cartel groups. What resulted was a flood of cheap drugs entering into the United States, spiking addiction rates, and spreading drug-related crime across the United States. Nixon then declared that these drugs were public enemy number one. This issue is important to me because I've personally struggled with drug abuse for years. I've lost friends to these substances. I've seen how they can wreck not only your own life, but the lives of the people closest to you. Nixon's shift in national policy towards a proactive rather than reactive strategy that we've seen throughout its history is largely credited with kicking off what we now know of as the war on drugs.
That's it. That's when the just say no shit starts happening. What war on drugs? War on what?
Were passed that allowed for direct military aid to Mexican, Central, and South American governments, as well as American advisors to integrate with their militaries actively engaging with these cartels. American helicopters, ammunition, and small arms made their way into Mexico and South America, all with the strings attached that they would be used to combat these cartels. Armed conflict between governments and cartels continued throughout the remainders of 70s, 80s, and 90s, but due to the deep-rooted control of cartel institutions and corruption on the side of these governments, many of the arms and training knowledge found its way into the ranks of the cartels themselves. It's estimated that by the mid-1990s, when the war on drugs was in full swing, 70% of cocaine and 30% of heroin transmitted through Mexico into the United States. Mexican cartels grew in size, strength, and complexity. Groups such as the Guadalajara Cartel took advantage of the lucrative deals with the Colombians and solidified their hold on the American drug market. Mexico began their own attempts at putting higher pressure on cartels in order to curb their influence, such as the 1985 arrest of the head of the Guadalajara Cartel, which resulted in fragmentation of the group into the Tijuana, Juarez, and Sinaloa cartels. And while this did slow down the influx of drugs to the United States to some degree, it spiked violence inside of Mexico itself as the now split cartels fought themselves for control. This would prove to be a trend in the fight against cartels later on. The head of one group was killed or arrested, resulting in a breakup into smaller cartels fighting each other until clear territories were established and one came out on top as the most powerful. Rinse and repeat this process. The 1990s saw the remnants of the Guadalajara Cartel responsible for the growth of violent and homicide in Mexico, with the Tijuana cartel controlling most of the border region, Juarez controlling many of the routes into and out of Texas, and finally the Sinaloa cartel, headed by Joaquin Guzman, aka El Chapo. They stood up as the largest and most powerful of the three. The unfortunate side effect of three smaller cartels in the 90s, rather than just one large one in the 80s, was that due to the increased competition of business, each tried to be more violent, more ruthless, and more deeply embedded with the population than the other. This competition was bad for everyone. American officials estimate 94% of heroin consumed in the United States today comes from Mexico. Their bottom line was profit, and they were not afraid to use any means necessary to secure control. When Guerrero was arrested for an American DEA agent's murder, for the first time, this exposed the fact that politicians and law enforcement inside of Mexico were insanely corrupt and had been for a long time. Within days of the arrest, the media started to ask uncomfortable questions and pressure the police. Several high-ranking police commanders were arrested, and 90 officers deserted, fearing their corruption would be exposed. The Mexican people had reached this tipping point where they were at their wits' end, and they were getting ready to vote for a major change of direction, which leads us to a big reason as to the cartel origin story ever being possible in the first place that rarely anyone talks about. And it has to do with the political space in Mexico. Since 1929, throughout this whole time period that we've talked about, the Institutional Revolutionary Party was in charge in Mexico. For a vast stretch of time, for 71 years, the Mexican government had been, let's say, very much accommodating to the drug cartels. It would be like if the Democrats or Republicans were in charge in the US government for 7 decades straight and got to have their way the whole time. You might wish that your party would win every single time, but if that actually happened in reality, it'd be a recipe for corruption. Absolutely. Mexico's Institutional Revolutionary Party had a policy of close relationship between the government and its drug cartels. This you pat my back, I'll reach around pat your back meant there wasn't very much violence. But this bargain they struck basically came at the cost of them making sure that the drug cartels were subject to very little criminal investigations. For example, in 1997, General Jesus Rebelio, the appointed head of the National Institution to Combat Drugs, was arrested after it was discovered that he'd been collaborating with Juarez Cartel. It would be like if the head of the DEA in the United States turned out to be corrupted by American drug cartels. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, within the Mexican government's centralized political structure, drug trafficking groups cultivated a wide network of corrupt officials through which they were able to gain distribution rights, market access, and protection. Not a great look, and the Mexican people weren't happy about this. And it was part of the reason why in 2000, they voted for the first time in 7 decades for change. Vincent Fox for the National Action Party was elected. He reformed the whole Mexican government and blasted away bureaucracy and completely destroyed links to the drug cartels in the government. He replaced corrupted officials left and right, eventually arresting 79,000 people tied to the cartels.
Damn.
And replaced top and mid-level personnel in the state's attorney's office and state judicial police. In 2000, we can see INEGI, Mexico's national statistics agency, recorded 10,743 homicides in Mexico. This number dropped gradually to 8,897 in 2007. The incoming new National Action Party destroyed the government's relationships that were managing Mexico's entire drug trade. The cartels used to be able to depend on political partners and their control of the police. How did the cartels respond? Over the next few years, at this time, we would see the cartels would turn into what we think of as the ruthless cartels of today. They built private militias and armies as a way of hedging their bets against any possible political outcome in the future. No one saw the danger that was coming on the horizon. The National Action Party was re-elected in 2006, as it seemed this new direction of fighting the cartels and rooting out corruption was working. Felipe Calderón continued the crackdown on the cartels. 45,000 military troops, 12,000 police officers were deployed to root out the cartels. Officials reported 25 of the 37 drug traffickers on Calderón's most wanted list were jailed, extradited to the US, or killed. From their point of view, everything was going as according to plan. But like we've seen in the past, this led to the cartels fragmenting, fighting each other, and increasing violence against everyone.
It all goes to shit. It always goes to shit. It goes to everybody stabbing each other in the back, robbing each other, smashing each other's wives, all kind of horrible shit that leads to innocent people getting eaten by the process.
Slowly. Homicides jumped up to 14,000 in 2008, leaping 23% in 2010 to 24,000 people. And in 2020, it was 36,579 people in Mexico that were killed.
Damn.
In 2012, after being out of power for 12 years, the Institutional Revolutionary Party then regained power, and the two presidents since then have attempted to kind of roll back the military crackdown somewhat. The origins of the Mexican drug cartel have their roots in unintended consequences of laws by both the American and Mexican governments. These laws could never have foreseen some of the side effects American and Mexican governments.
I'll never take this guy serious ever in life just after seeing him when those 5 kids were abducted by the cartel and told to unalive each other. And their families were there. The media was there screaming in his face for information, and he mocked them and did the Hulk Hogan to them and shit. That dude.
These laws could never have foreseen some of the side effects that would contribute to the cartels in later decades. We can't see into the future and determine how our actions today will affect tomorrow. After the turn of the millennia and up to today, Mexico finds itself in a constant, unending tug of war for control with these cartels. In many parts of Mexico, these groups are essentially rival governments in their own right, carving out territories and holding them with small armies against anyone trying to interfere with how they run things. They have deep-rooted cultural ties to the area, provide a sense of economic stability to the local population, and have sophisticated methods of retaining power. So hopefully, by looking at how drug cartels rose to power, we can gain some kind of insight into how to best destroy them. When I get frustrated by how little progress it seems like we've been able to make against Mexican drug cartels, I like to think of a common phrase we used to say at Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and it goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.